Venezuela has made a decision that is shaking Washington's dominance in the Western Hemisphere and redefining what sovereignty means in the modern era. Pause. After the United States government seized multiple Venezuelan oil tankers in international waters, something unprecedented happened. Caracas didn't back down. They didn't negotiate. They didn't issue empty diplomatic protests. Instead, Venezuela executed a counteroffensive that has left American policymakers scrambling and exposed a critical vulnerability in U.S. sanctions architecture. On February 27, 2026, the U.S. Coast Guard, acting under Treasury Department orders, intercepted and seized 4 Venezuelan-flagged oil tankers carrying an estimated 900,000 barrels of crude oil valued at over $60 million. The official justification? Violations of sanctions imposed under the Venezuela sanctions regulations. But within 72 hours, Venezuela announced the immediate seizure of American corporate assets valued at over $1.2 billion, the expulsion of remaining U.S. diplomatic personnel, and a formal complaint filed with the International Court of Justice. Emphasis: this wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was calculated retaliation. What's happening behind this decision goes far deeper than a single confrontation over oil shipments. Pause. This move represents a fundamental challenge to the United States' ability to enforce unilateral economic sanctions, not just in Venezuela, but across the entire global South. For decades, Washington has wielded financial isolation as a weapon more powerful than missiles. Freeze the assets, block the banks, seize the ships. The playbook has worked from Iraq to Iran, from Syria to Sudan. But Venezuela just tore up that playbook. The question every geopolitical analyst is now asking is this: pause. How did a country that Washington declared economically destroyed, politically isolated, and strategically irrelevant manage to execute such a sophisticated and damaging counterstrike? And more importantly, what does this mean for the future of American power projection in a world where more and more countries are watching and learning from Venezuela's example? Emphasis: this isn't just about oil tankers. This is about the erosion of the mechanisms that have kept American hegemony intact for 3 generations. Pause. But first, we need to understand how we got here. To understand why this moment is so crucial, we must go back to 1999, when Hugo Chavez came to power and fundamentally reoriented Venezuela's relationship with the United States. For most of the 20th century, Venezuela had been what Washington considered a model Latin American partner. It had the largest proven oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere, and American companies, particularly ExxonMobil and Chevron, controlled the majority of extraction operations. Venezuelan crude flowed north, American dollars flowed south, and the political elite in Caracas remained friendly to U.S. interests. Chavez shattered that arrangement. In 2001, his government passed the hydrocarbons law, which reasserted state control over oil production and mandated majority Venezuelan ownership of all extraction projects. American companies were forced to renegotiate contracts under far less favorable terms. ExxonMobil refused and pulled out entirely in 2007. The U.S. response was predictable but measured at first: diplomatic pressure, support for opposition parties, and the beginning of targeted sanctions against Venezuelan officials. But the real escalation began in 2015, when President Obama declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. Pause. Let that phrase sink in for a moment. Venezuela, a country with no significant military projection capability, no nuclear weapons, and no history of attacking American interests, was officially designated a national security threat. The designation allowed Washington to impose sweeping financial sanctions. By 2017, under President Trump, those sanctions expanded to include Venezuela's oil sector, freezing $7 billion in assets and blocking access to U.S. financial institutions. The strategy was clear: strangle the Venezuelan economy, create internal political chaos, and either force regime change or collapse the government entirely. And for a while, it seemed to be working. Inflation skyrocketed, GDP contracted by more than 60% between 2013 and 2020. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country. And faces Western media declared the Maduro government finished. But something unexpected happened. Venezuela didn't collapse. Instead, it adapted. It began selling oil to China, Russia, India, and Turkey, often using cryptocurrencies and barter arrangements to bypass the U.S.-dominated SWIFT banking system. It deepened military and economic ties with Moscow and Beijing. It joined regional alliances that explicitly rejected U.S. influence. And most importantly, it learned how to survive in a world where Washington's financial weapons had lost their guaranteed lethality. For decades, this system seemed unshakable. The United States controlled the global financial infrastructure, the reserve currency, and the legal frameworks that allowed it to seize assets anywhere in the world. But something changed. Pause. The unipolar moment began to fracture. So what exactly happened in the last 6 months that led to this dramatic confrontation? The timeline reveals a calculated escalation, not a spontaneous crisis. In September 2025, the Biden administration announced it would not renew the temporary sanctions relief that had allowed Chevron to resume limited operations in Venezuela. The official reason was Venezuela's refusal to hold what Washington considered free and fair elections. But the real motivation was pressure from Republican lawmakers and a desire to project toughness in an election year. Venezuela's government immediately condemned the move but took no immediate action. That restraint was strategic. In October, U.S. intelligence agencies reported that Venezuela had signed a comprehensive defense agreement with Russia, including the provision of advanced air defense systems and electronic warfare equipment. The Pentagon expressed concern, but no new sanctions were imposed. Then, in November, satellite imagery confirmed that Chinese state-owned oil companies had dramatically increased their presence in Venezuelan oil fields, with infrastructure investments exceeding $3 billion. Again, Washington issued statements but took no concrete action. The real trigger came in January 2026. The U.S. Treasury Department, under pressure from both parties in Congress, announced a new executive order authorizing the seizure of any vessel carrying Venezuelan oil, regardless of its destination or the nationality of its operator. Emphasis: this wasn't just sanctions. This was an undeclared blockade. The legal justification was thin, relying on expansive interpretations of executive authority and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. On February 27th, that policy was put into action. 4 tankers, 2 registered in Liberia, 1 in Panama, and 1 directly under Venezuelan flag, were intercepted. The ships were en route to China and India. None were heading to U.S. waters. The cargo was seized, the crews detained, and the vessels impounded in Puerto Rico. The U.S. government claimed this was a lawful enforcement action. International law experts immediately disputed that claim, arguing that seizing ships in international waters without a UN Security Council resolution constitutes piracy under maritime law. Venezuela's response was swift and devastating. Within 72 hours, President Maduro appeared on national television and announced what he called Operation Sovereign Recovery, Pause. Here's what that entailed. First, the immediate nationalization of all remaining U.S. corporate assets in Venezuela, including Chevron's residual operations estimated at $800 million and frozen assets of American banks operating in the country. Second, the seizure of 4 American-owned cargo vessels currently in Venezuelan ports with crews held under what Caracas called administrative detention. Third, the formal severing of all remaining diplomatic relations with the expulsion of the last 12 U.S. diplomatic personnel. And fourth, a public declaration that Venezuela would no longer recognize the jurisdiction of any U.S. court or financial institution. But there's something more important that traditional media largely ignored. POW's Venezuela didn't act alone. Within days, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia issued statements of full support. Russia's foreign ministry called the U.S. tanker seizures an act of state piracy. China's Ministry of Commerce announced it would continue purchasing Venezuelan oil and would provide financial mechanisms to bypass U.S. sanctions. Iran, which has faced similar sanctions for decades, offered technical assistance in sanctions evasion and cryptocurrency-based trade. Even countries that aren't traditional Venezuelan allies, like Mexico and Colombia, issued surprisingly mild criticisms of Caracas while expressing concern about U.S. overreach. This coordination reveals something Washington has tried desperately to deny: emphasis. The sanctions infrastructure that once terrified nations into compliance is now seen as an obstacle to be worked around, not a wall that cannot be breached. Why did Venezuela take this risk? The economic motivations are clear. With oil prices hovering above $80 per barrel, Venezuela's proven reserves of 300 billion barrels represent an asset worth over $24 trillion. That's not a typo. Pause. $24 trillion. Even producing at reduced capacity due to underinvestment and sanctions, Venezuela can generate tens of billions annually if it can secure reliable buyers and payment mechanisms. China and India have both demonstrated they're willing to be those buyers, sanctions or no sanctions. Politically, Maduro's government faces constant internal pressure. The economy has stabilized somewhat since 2020, but living standards remain far below pre-crisis levels. Demonstrating strength against the United States plays extremely well domestically. Every Venezuelan, regardless of their opinion of Maduro, resents the sanctions and their impact on daily life. Standing up to Washington generates genuine nationalist support that crosses ideological lines. From a security perspective, Venezuela has watched what happened to Iraq, Libya, and Ukraine. They understand that once you give up your leverage, once you submit to Western demands, regime change becomes inevitable. Saddam Hussein disarmed. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program. Viktor Yanukovych tried to balance East and West. All three met violent ends. EM phases Venezuela has no intention of being the next cautionary tale. What comes next is crucial because this isn't just about bilateral relations between Washington and Caracas. This is about the future architecture of global power. At this point, I need to step back from emotion and look at this through a realist lens. There's a well-established framework in international relations that explains exactly why this unfolded the way it did and why it's likely to keep happening. Great powers maintain their dominance through a combination of military strength, economic leverage, and institutional control. For the United States, that institutional control has meant dominance over the global financial system, international legal frameworks, and the norms that govern state behavior. When a great power is at the peak of its strength, smaller states comply with its demands not because they agree morally, but because the costs of defiance are unbearable. But here's the critical insight. Pause. That system only works when the great power can credibly enforce consequences and when there are no alternative patrons available to protect defiant states. Venezuela's calculus is entirely rational. The costs of compliance with U.S. demands, full sanctions relief, would require fundamental political change, including likely regime change. That cost is unacceptable because it means political death for the current leadership. The costs of defiance used to be equally unacceptable: economic collapse, possible military intervention, complete isolation, but those costs have decreased dramatically. Why? Because the international system is no longer unipolar. China and Russia provide alternative sources of trade, investment, technology, and political support. They have both the capacity and the willingness to sustain countries under U.S. pressure. This creates what strategists call daylight, room to maneuver between great powers. Venezuela is exploiting that daylight. From a purely strategic perspective, Venezuela's move makes sense. Emphasis. It raises the cost for Washington of maintaining sanctions. Every seized tanker now risks counter seizures. Every frozen asset now triggers nationalizations. Every diplomatic expulsion gets reciprocated. The American policy, which relied on asymmetric costs, where Washington could inflict pain without suffering consequences, no longer works. This is not about morality. This is not about democracy or human rights or any ideological framing. This is about power, leverage, and the rational calculations that states make when survival is at stake. Venezuela assessed that the risk of escalation was lower than the risk of continued submission. And critically, they assessed that the United States overstretched globally, facing challenges in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Taiwan Strait, would be unwilling or unable to respond with overwhelming force. That assessment appears to be correct. The U.S. response so far has been limited to additional sanctions designations, which Venezuela is already ignoring, and diplomatic protests, which have no enforcement mechanism. There has been no military response, no blockade, no intervention. Why? Because the costs of escalation are now too high for Washington as well. Think about this for a moment. Pause. If the United States launches a military operation to recover seized assets or ships, it legitimizes military responses to sanctions enforcement globally. If China or Russia decided to seize American corporate assets in retaliation for sanctions, could Washington argue it's illegal after doing the same? If the U.S. imposes a naval blockade, does that justify blockades by other nations? Every escalatory step creates precedents that undermine American interests elsewhere. This is the trap of declining hegemony. The tools that worked when you were overwhelmingly dominant become liabilities when your dominance is contested. Sanctions worked when there were no alternatives. Seizures worked when no one could retaliate. Threats worked when everyone believed you'd follow through. But when other powers provide alternatives, when targets can retaliate, and when your threats are no longer credible because you're overstretched, those tools break. Venezuela understands this, and they're betting that Washington understands it too. This isn't just about Venezuela. The consequences will affect the entire sanctions architecture that has been central to American foreign policy for 2 decades. Right now, in capitals from Tehran to Pyongyang, from Harare to Minsk, governments are watching and learning. They're seeing that retaliation is possible. They're seeing that alternative systems exist. They're seeing that the United States, despite its rhetoric, is not willing or able to enforce compliance through military means every time a country defies sanctions. Emphasis. That perception is more dangerous to American power than any single weapons system. For the entire region, this move signals a fundamental shift. Latin America has been considered the United States' backyard since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. That 200-year assumption is now openly challenged. If Venezuela can defy Washington successfully, why can't others? Cuba has already survived 60 years of sanctions. Nicaragua is increasingly aligned with Venezuela and Russia. Even traditional allies like Brazil and Mexico are pursuing more independent foreign policies, refusing to take sides in great power competition. The economic implications are profound. If Venezuelan oil flows freely to China and India despite U.S. sanctions, it adds over 1 million barrels per day to global supply outside American control. That affects oil prices, energy security calculations, and the leverage Washington has over other producers. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are watching. If they see that U.S. security guarantees are weakening and that alternative partnerships are viable, the entire petrodollar system, which has been fundamental to American economic power since 1974, comes under threat. The international financial system faces a credibility crisis. The U.S. dollar remains the global reserve currency, but its weaponization through sanctions has driven more and more countries to seek alternatives. China's yuan is increasingly used in bilateral trade. Cryptocurrencies, despite their volatility, are being explored as sanctions-resistant payment systems. Even European allies have discussed creating independent payment mechanisms to trade with sanctioned countries. Every time Washington freezes assets or blocks transactions, it provides an incentive for other nations to build systems that exclude the dollar. In the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see an acceleration of what economists call de-dollarization. It won't be sudden or complete, but the trajectory is clear. More trade in local currencies, more use of gold and commodities as settlement mechanisms, more development of alternative financial infrastructure, and with every step in that direction, American power to shape global economic behavior diminishes. The security calculations are equally concerning for Washington. If economic coercion no longer works reliably, the only alternatives are military force or diplomatic accommodation. Military force is expensive, politically unpopular at home, and risks escalation with peer competitors. Diplomatic accommodation means accepting that the United States cannot dictate outcomes everywhere, that some countries will choose governance systems Washington opposes, that American preferences will be ignored. That's the world Venezuela's action is helping to create. Not single-handedly, of course. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the expansion of BRICS, and the general diffusion of power away from the West are all part of the same process. But Venezuela's successful defiance is a highly visible demonstration that the emperor's clothes, the mechanisms of American dominance, are threadbare. For ordinary people, including Americans, this means volatility. Energy prices will likely remain elevated as sanctioned producers find alternative markets and reduce the leverage of traditional U.S. allies. Inflation could persist as supply chains reorganize around political rather than purely economic logic. The value of the dollar might decline gradually as its use in international transactions decreases. And the risk of military conflict increases as the United States faces choices between accepting diminished influence or using force to maintain it. But there's another side to consider. A multipolar world where no single power can unilaterally impose its will might actually be more stable in the long run. It forces negotiation rather than diktat. It creates checks on any one nation's worst impulses. It allows different societies to organize themselves according to their own values rather than being forced into a single model. That's not necessarily a world of chaos. It could be a world of balance. Venezuela has demonstrated that defiance of American sanctions, when supported by alternative great powers, and executed with strategic discipline, is not only possible, but potentially successful. What we're witnessing is not a temporary disruption or an anomaly, but a fundamental test of the post-Cold War order. When you can seize a great power's assets and ships in retaliation for that great power seizing yours and face no overwhelming punishment, the balance of power has shifted. This move marks the moment when a medium-sized sanctioned state openly challenged the enforcement mechanisms of American hegemony and, at least in the short term, prevailed. The long-term consequences of that precedent will ripple through international relations for decades. The unipolar world is fragmenting, and Venezuela is positioning itself not as a victim of that fragmentation, but as an active agent of change in this new multipolar reality. The twist nobody saw coming wasn't that the U.S. seized the tankers. That was predictable. The twist was that Venezuela hit back hard, and so far has gotten away with it. Pause. That changes everything.